All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are taking the time to join live. I appreciate it. And for those of you who will watch later, also thumbs up. I am presenting live from Delano, California. And you might be asking, where's Delano, California? Well, it's north of Bakersfield. And if you're honestly asking where's Bakersfield, that's fair too, because it's far north, past Los Angeles, about 6 hours from San Diego. I'm at my in-laws' house and we're visiting them since we haven't seen them, as my mother-in-law appropriately said, we haven't seen you since August 6th. I'm like, do you remember the day? She's like, yes. I was like, thank you. We miss you too. Okay, so welcome to the workshop on global conflict and cooperation. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. I'll close this. So this workshop was started in the summer of this year, and we're continuing it for the entire fall semester. It's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. Now, we already had our first 8 weeks, so you're welcome to go back to those. I've been focusing this semester on different countries or geographic regions of the world. And I think I'll continue that up until week 13, and then probably the last 4 weeks, I'll turn it into more of conceptual things again to kind of tie things back together as we're wrapping up. Note that if you want to get a better understanding of the concepts of global conflict and cooperation, you're welcome to watch the recordings from the summer, which give an overview, senses of regional conflict cooperation, operationalizing those things, and then some applications of that to Afghan, Eritrea, climate change, and bilateralism. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump to week 10, which is the Americas part 2. So in the prior week, I introduced the region of the Americas, and this functionally includes North America, Central America, and South America, and all the countries in between, also to include the Caribbean as well. And this is what we call the Western Hemisphere of the globe. And a lot of activity goes on in this region, given the basically the United States' presence, but also the emerging countries of like Brazil and Argentina and Mexico. And just makes a big difference to understand things not only from a country perspective, or maybe two-country perspective, or from a Western kind of perspective where we're looking at, say, the US and Europe, but also in different parts of the world. So I'm happy to bring part 2 of the Americas to light. Our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is to define the Americas region, to describe an example of conflict, and then to provide an example of cooperation in the region. So again, remind ourselves that this region includes Canada, United States, Mexico, the Caribbean countries, and then the Central American countries, and then in South America, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and others. A very vast region of the world. On one side, buffered by the Pacific Ocean, both the north and southern parts of it, and on the other side, buffered by the Atlantic Ocean. And so sometimes I point to this is like the ocean squeeze of the countries, because it's surrounded by the 2 largest oceans in the world. And the relationship that they have with each other is basically connected by a tiny land mass of Costa Rica and Panama. And so that bottleneck kind of changes the dynamic with respect to the relations in this region. And knowing that the United States has been basically a global power for the past 50, 70 years, depending on when you want to start counting it, its outsized influence in the region. And so we talked about that a little bit last week. And then this week, I'll talk about, again, a specific country, in this case, Colombia, and then we'll look at an example of cooperation and the implications, in this case, of the country of Mexico taking on a greater role in facilitating interactions and relationship building in the region. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the conflict. And in this case, we'll look at the conflict in Colombia. And I already had it open over here, so we'll pull that up. And what I'll do is I'll have the computer screen read it to us, since it's a little clearer sometimes when that happens. So I'm going to go ahead and play this first background of it, and we'll have at it. So I'm going to go ahead and play it here.
The Colombian conflict, Spanish, Conflicto Armado Interno de Colombia, began on May 27, 1964, and is a low-intensity asymmetric war between the government of Colombia, far-right paramilitary groups, crime syndicates, and far-left guerrilla groups such as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, the National Liberation Army, ELN, and the Popular Liberation Army, EPL, fighting each other to increase their influence in Colombian territory. 48. Some of the most important international contributors to the Colombian conflict include multinational corporations, the United States, 49, 50, 51, Cuba, 52, and the drug trafficking industry, 53. It is historically rooted in the conflict known as La Violencia, which was triggered by the 1948 assassination of liberal political leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, 54, and in the aftermath of the anti-communist repression in rural Colombia in the 1960s that led liberal and communist militants to reorganize into FARC, 55. The reasons for fighting vary from group to group. The FARC and other guerrilla movements claim to be fighting for the rights of the poor in Colombia, to protect them from government violence, and to provide social justice through communism. 56. The Colombian government claims to be fighting for order and stability, and to protect the rights and interests of its citizens. The paramilitary groups claim to be reacting to perceived threats by guerrilla movements. 57. According to a study by Colombia's National Center for Historical Memory, 220,000 people have died in the conflict between 1958 and 2013, most of them civilians, 177,307 civilians and 40,787 fighters, and more than 5 million civilians were forced from their homes between 1985 and 2012, generating the world's second-largest population of internally displaced persons, IDPs. 43, 58, 59, 16.9% of the population in Colombia has been a direct victim of the war. 60, 2.3 million children have been displaced from their homes, and 45,000 children killed, according to national figures cited by UNICEF. In total, 1 in 3 of the 7.6 million registered victims of the conflict are children, and since 1985, 8,000 minors have disappeared. 46. A special unit was created to search for persons deemed as missing within the context of and due to the armed conflict. 61. On June 23, 2016, the Colombian government and the FARC rebels signed a historic ceasefire deal, bringing them closer to ending more than 5 decades of conflict. 62. Although the deal was rejected in the subsequent October plebiscite. 63. The same month, President of Colombia Juan Manuel Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to bring the country's more than 50-year-long civil war to an end. 64. A revised peace deal was signed the following month and submitted to Congress for approval. 65. The House of Representatives unanimously approved the plan on November 30, a day after the Senate also gave its backing. 66.
And so if you take the time to read through the rest of this Wikipedia page, you'll get I think, a very helpful sense of the history of this conflict in the country of Colombia. And I wanted to share this one because many of the times when we think about the Americas, we might have perceptions about countries given what we might have heard a little bit here, a little bit there in the news, or what a politician or a political leader might say about it. If we have family or friends from those countries, you kind of get an under the hood look about what's going on. So when I was in community college, I had at least 2 very good friends who had family in this country, and they shared the experiences and the trials and tribulations and like the war that basically their country went through, and why that was part of the reason why they came to the United States. And so when you think about any kind of conflict, we can think about it from like a country level and the battles between countries. In this case, this is an internal conflict or a civil war. And you just get a very introductory sense that there's, different factions for different reasons. But what's really emphasized in that introduction is like the human pull, the human cost of conflict. So when we think of conflict, it's not just like, a country at war with itself or with others, but like it's people, right? It's lives, like it's livelihoods, it's displacement, it's loss of life. And then if you watch documentaries about this conflict, or you read, not politically focused ones where you're looking at the leaders of countries or the relationships between them, but you look at what's going on with the people, like a people's history or a social history of this and other conflicts, realize just how harmful and damaging it is to not just them as individuals, but to the psyche of a country and to the psyche of a people as they move forward in any conflict. So in a prior workshop, I looked at the country of El Salvador, and I cited one of my former professors, Robin DeLungen at UC Merced, who studied the conflict in that country, and talking about this idea of shared memory. And so when we think of conflict, know that it gets embedded in people's minds, and that they carry that with them, and it shapes our perceptions of countries. So if you have friends who are Colombian or of Colombian background or descent or heritage or ancestry, they will know this as a part of their country's history. And it's both. I want to say it's sad, but it is, and at the same time, it's important to know these kinds of things so that when you're working through conflict in that country or in any other country, you know that there's ways of working through it, acknowledging the past, acknowledging the hurt, but obviously needing to move forward as any country does. So this gives us a very clear example of conflict, in this case, an internal civil conflict in a particular country. The next article I'd like to share is focused on cooperation, and the title of it's Assertive Mexico Seeks Leadership Role in Latin America. I'll go ahead and open up that article and have this read to us in full, because when I read this, and it was just published last month in September 2021, I was pretty surprised, like not being a close observer of what's going on in the Americas or in Latin America, particularly. Obviously, I'm more focused on what's happening in the United States with American politics and the like. But once I started reading this, I was like, wow, this is going to have immediate and long-term implications to not just the relationship that Mexico has with the region, but also the relationship that the United States would have with the region. So I'll go ahead and turn on this part of it, and we'll have it read out loud. I'm going to change the voice though, since I have a few options here. And I like highlighting this feature because some students actually like to use the audio to speak to them. I do personally, so that's pretty helpful. Okay.
Assertive Mexico seeks leadership role in Latin America. Mexico City, AP, a gathering of leaders from Latin America and the Caribbean this weekend in Mexico is the latest sign of that country flexing its diplomatic muscle as it looks to assert itself as the new mediator between the region and the United States. Whether or not Saturday's meeting in Mexico City of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, or CELAC, culminates in a rumored mass exodus from the Organization of American States, Mexico has signaled that it wants a leadership role in Latin America after years of focusing almost exclusively on its bilateral relationship with the U.S. It was precisely the closeness of that relationship that President Andrés Manuel López Obrador cited in July in proposing Mexico help the region open a dialogue with the U.S. government to reorient a relationship based on a 2-century-old model he said has no future. Turning their backs on the United States was also not an option, López Obrador said. It is time to express and explore another option, that of a dialogue with U.S. leaders, and to convince and persuade them that a new relationship among the countries of America is possible. The president said Mexico's proposal was for something closer to the model of the European Union. In that spirit, you mustn't rule out the substitution of the Organization of American States, with a truly autonomous body, a lackey to no one, he said. Enter the CELAC. Mexico was the organization's president last year, and its membership voted that Mexico continue in that role this year. CELAC has only existed for 10 years and is more left-leaning, having remained on good terms with countries including Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez was one of its biggest proponents. But for long stretches, it did not even meet. Unlike the OAS, the United States and Canada are not members, nor is Brazil, which withdrew in January 2020. Mexico Foreign Affairs Secretary Marcelo Ebrard has been outspoken on the inequality and disparities in access to COVID-19 vaccines, and CELAC became a vehicle for Mexico's efforts on that subject. Mexico pursued a multi-pronged strategy of direct purchases and participation in the multilateral efforts to obtain vaccine. But at the same time, Ebrard worked through CELAC to produce the AstraZeneca vaccine in the region Argentina and Mexico and distribute it here. Late last month, Ebrard turned to the OAS. The organization, he said, became out of date because the world changed, he said. Goodbye OAS, in its interventionist, interfering and hegemonic sense, Ebrard said to Applause. Hence the speculation that Mexico could lead other countries in leaving the OAS. Along with its vaccine efforts in the region, Mexico has hosted a new round of dialogue between the Venezuelan government and that country's opposition in Mexico City. López Obrador's administration had resisted pressure to recognize opposition leader Juan Guaidó. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro was one of the unexpected leaders who arrived late Friday in Mexico City for the meeting. This is his first trip outside Venezuela since the U.S. government indicted him on drug trafficking and terrorism charges in March 2020, and offered a reward of up to $15 million for him. Mexico's president has cooperated with both the Trump and Biden administrations on immigration, deploying Mexican security forces to try to contain migrants in southern Mexico and allowing the U.S. to return non-Mexican asylum seekers to await their cases in Mexico. López Obrador has asked the Biden administration to support the expansion of two of his signature social programs to Central America's Northern Triangle to address the root causes of migration.
So this article just goes on to wrap up this report about how Mexico's taking a greater leadership role in the region. And what's really fascinating about this is, at least from my perspective, is twofold in addition to what I mentioned earlier. First is that it's being led by the country of Mexico, which is viewed as like a gateway to the United States. But they're not saying, look at us as the gateway to the United States, look at us as helping bring together what is functionally the largest Spanish-speaking community in the world, because Spanish is the predominant language in the region. And there's a shared sense or shared belief in the region of like a common destiny or a common purpose that's been examined and studied in many ways. And so seeing this happen like in reality is pretty interesting in a sense. The second thing is when I read this article and it mentioned the European Union, I was like, that's very fascinating. Because if you think about what the European Union is, it's basically independent countries that have organically through, they fought wars and a lot of people passed away and were killed in those conflicts, but after those conflicts, they resolved to work cooperatively on a small set of issues and they slowly expanded it to a whole range of issues now to where they're almost like a functioning federal system, basically, where they have like a central government like we do in the United States, and they have their country governments doing their own thing. There's obviously still a very strong sense of country and of sovereignty and the like. And I would imagine that if this effort is going to move in that direction, it would probably have the same sense of like we're Brazil and we're Argentina and we're Mexico, like we have our own things. But at the same time, if they're able to develop that common unity, and turn it into not just a political, forum to talk, but tangible economic, social, and other linkages between those countries, then that can become a very formidable force in global affairs, given its position in the world and obviously its partnership in some ways or its relationship with the United States being in the same region. So it's just an entirely different way of thinking about the Americas, not just as like the United States and the Monroe Doctrine and no one comes in and intrudes and we're going to run the show, but it's like the countries of the region kind of saying we're going to stand up on our own and move in a direction that we want to go, which is pretty fascinating overall. So with that, I'll just point out the implications of all this and I'll pull up the website of CELAC so you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. And what's really interesting is this, see if the translation works properly, but they have a vision or vision for 2030 and basically saying like, want to see what our future can be like if we work together. And so things like how do we build our transportation systems? How do we build our things like rail, airport, port, seaports? How do we bring together our ability to connect with each other? How do we to trade with each other, to facilitate movement of people across the region? So basically maybe lowering barriers to immigration or to just people visiting one country versus the other without having this, basically less constraints. Like in the United States, you can go to Arizona without having your passport be viewed and checked and signed and moved on. So overall, I'm just pretty fascinated that the region is reached this point and kind of looking forward to see how it evolves in the coming years. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop the recording so we can have a bit of Q&A. Thanks for taking the time to watch. I appreciate it.